Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be on the doctrine of separation with specific emphasis on its overlap with our evangelical charter. Now, as Christians, we are called to travel to the ends of the earth to win the lost, but one of the realities is that the world is enemy territory in spiritual warfare. So the very real possibility is in our attempt to win the lost being won over by the lost. Now, the practice I wish to encourage and recommend in light of this study is to approach any spiritual equation not only in its whole, but in the balance of the elements which comprise the whole. Now, in this specific equation, we have two independent but intersecting criteria to deal with in order to assess our responsibilities in attaining a difficult balance to reach out into the world and to bring them to the church without having the church succumb or submerge to the world in the process thereof. Now, we are to avoid the extreme of isolation, pharisaical excess, whereby we completely remove ourselves from the world because we cannot reach that which we are not in contact with. Yet we are to maintain our contact without being contaminated by the world. And this is very, very difficult. But it can be done with prayer and contemplation. And from the contemplation springs an awareness of the nuances of the balances in our which we are to consider when arriving at our equation for the formula. Now, the formula consists of two main essential ingredients, that being separation and evangelism. And as in any coin, there are two sides of it. Now, the problem with the Jews in the Old Testament, now Elohim's people have always been called to be evangelists, but we don't witness too much evangelism from the Jews in the Old Testament. They were commanded to be separated from the other nations, and they cultivated this extreme at the expense of reaching out to them. But the evangelical ethos is clearly enunciated in the initiation of the fourth dispensation, which began when Yahweh called Abram, as he was then known more familiarly to posterity as Abraham. And now this can be found in the first three verses of the 12th chapter of Genesis, which reads, "And Yahweh said to Abram, Go yourself out of your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house, to a land which I show you." So that first verse, the immediate consequences of obeying this command is separation from everything that is familiar, everything that is comfortable. Abram was called from the city of Ur, which was in ancient Mesopotamia. It was a city of some significance in its own day. And he was called to be a nomad. Now, at the time, nomads existed on the periphery and connected civilizations to each other in the ancient Near East. And Abraham was called to leave a comfortable, settled life where all indications pointed to he came from a land where idols were worshipped. And by this time, 10 generations removed from Noah, all of humanity had been estranged from its creator until the creator picked one for the specific task of fathering a nation which was to be separated to him and separated from the world. But in order to bring the world to him, that was their mission, that was their failing. "And I shall make you a great nation, and bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." This is the promise to look forward to as a consequence of honoring the call for separation as initiated in the commandment. And the third verse is the most explicitly evangelical. "And I shall bless those who bless you, and curse him who curses you. And in you all the clans of the earth shall be blessed." This was the purpose for which Israel was made, but they were content to hoard the blessing of the divine revelation, which they somewhat neglected, at least in its fullness, because they emphasized certain elements at the expense and to the detriment of others. And by the New Testament time, the Pharisaical, they had the excess of separatism to an absurd extreme, which produces little tangible results. But the principles of separation were also enunciated in Israel's dietary and sanitary laws of physical illness. They were to keep themselves separated from one was ceremoniously disqualified for having certain physical ailments, and for good reason. But really, they were also commanded to be separated from spiritually contaminating elements. And we're just going to read some of the outlines for the Nazarites. Now, all Jews in general were called to be separated, but Nazarites were called to be separate for a specific purpose. And some of the injunctions are in the 6th chapter of Numbers. We're going to read from the 3rd to the 9th verse, because in each of those verses the word separation repeats itself. He separates from wine and strong drink. He drinks neither vinegar of wine nor vinegar of strong drinks. Neither does he drink any grape juice, nor eat any grapes or raisins. So abstinence from alcohol was part of the Nazarite vow, and examples of Nazarite include Samuel and Samson and John the Baptist. And they were, alcohol has a spiritually contaminating effect. Now, abstinence is not commanded in the Bible, but drunkenness is condemned as a sin throughout. All the days of his separation he does not eat whatever is made of the grapevine, from seed to skin. All the days of the vow of his separation a razor does not come upon his head, until the days are completed for which he separates himself to Yahweh. He is sacred. He shall not let the locks of the hair of his head grow long. And the source of Samson's strength, we read of in Judges 13 through 16, came from the length of his hair. So as long as he honored the Nazarite vow to which he was commanded, he would be blessed with inordinate, extraordinary human strength. And all the days of his separation to Yahweh, he does not go near a dead body. A dead body was ceremonially unclean, and the contamination of it, the Jews avoided them like the plague. It was, they had an almost irrational fear of being contaminated by a dead body, the touch thereof. He does not make for himself unclean for his father or for his mother, for his brother or his sister, when they die, because his separation to Elohim is on his head. So they were not even allowed to bury their family members. So seriously was this vow to be taken by them. All the days of his separation he is sacred to Yahweh. And when anyone dies besides him in an instant, suddenly, and he has defiled the head of his separation, then he shall shave his head on the day of his cleansing. On the 7th day he shaves it. So these are the outlines and expectations, some of them which emphasize the separatist aspect of the Nazarene. And there were certain sects in Judaism, the Essenes, for example, they retreated to the secluded wilderness because the fear of ceremonial defilement made solitary the only security. And also, the theme of separation is expounded upon in some of the writings of the prophets. For example, we read in Isaiah 52:1, "Awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion, put on your garments of splendor, O Jerusalem, the sacred city. For no more do the uncircumcised and the unclean come into you." Now, at face value, this may appear to be a rejection of the Gentiles, but in light of the new covenant promise of the universal invitation and extension of salvation, this actually prophesies and points towards a day when the Gentiles would no longer be considered unclean and they'd be welcome into the flock. And the psalmist also writes on this. David was a king in Jerusalem, and one of the longest, most fullest, and most eloquent expressions of the doctrine of separatism throughout the Old Testament is found in Psalm 101, verses 3 through 8. "I put no matter of Baal before my eyes. I hate the work of those who fall away. It does not cling to me." Baal was one of the rival, erroneous, non-existent deities who nevertheless captured much of the affection of the chosen people throughout their history. They were commanded to be kept separated from idols and idolaters, because that would compromise their exclusive concentration of worship in Yahweh, where it rightly belonged. A perverse heart turns away from me. I do not know evil. Him who secretly slanders his neighbor, I cut off. I do not tolerate one who has a haughty look and a proud heart. As the king, he would have been responsible for organizing and assembling the counselors who had an influence on his decision-making, and the imperative for them to be pure men, not prone to gossip, was all the more imperative given the burden of their responsibility. My eyes are on the trustworthy of the land, to dwell with me. He who walks in a perfect way, he serves me. He who practices deceit does not dwell in my house. He who speaks lies does not stand in my presence. Each morning I uproot all the wicked of the land, to cut off the workers of wickedness from the city of Yahweh. So this was his task as the king, as the enforcer of the central government. He had a responsibility to honor. He was to be guided and governed according to the precepts of the Mosaic covenant, and he implicitly endorses it and admonishes. He assures Yahweh in the form of prayer that he is honoring his end of the agreement. And the principle of separation remains current throughout the New Testament, and perhaps the most famous passage identifying it is 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1, which reads, "Do not become unevenly yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? And what fellowship has light with darkness?" Now, to be yoked with unbelievers entails a qualitatively more submissive and submerged relationship to the world. We are to maintain contact with them without being contaminated by them. That means we never see the influential initiative to them. We can have friends in the world, but not be friends of the world. And we, as Christians, are implicitly admonished to be in the world, but not of the world. The former injunction respects the realities that we are creatures of time and space and exist in such. But the latter end of the injunction calls us to a more exalted ideal while living in the parameters of time and space. But the incompatibleness of righteousness and lawlessness are self-evident, demands neither analysis or extrapolation. And what fellowship has light with darkness is a rhetorical question. Light and darkness cannot simultaneously coexist, at least not in the same place, in same space and time at the same time. And what agreement has Messiah with Baal? Or what does a believer have with an unbeliever? This is, again, a reference to Baal, who figured prominently as a rival deity for worship throughout the Old Testament. His legacy and influence was clearly present in the writing of the New Testament, so much so that Paul makes mention of him. And what union has the temple of Elohim with idols? For you are a temple of the living Elohim. As Yahweh has said, I shall dwell in them and walk among them, and I shall be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. Idols were expressly forbidden by the Mosaic injunctions, and he calls them to be temples. This means that their body is a temple of spiritual vessels, so we are humans operating in spiritual environments, spiritual beings operating in human environments, and not vice versa. And idols were one of the things with which the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, you can type in Corey Johnston, Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, for more details on that. But one of the areas, they made a lot of accommodations and compromises with the influx of the Gentile majority, who displaced the Jewish nucleus as the majority of the early Christian faith. But one of the 4 items they could not compromise on was no idols. So that remained in effect throughout the New Testament. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says Yahweh, and do not touch what is unclean, and I shall receive you. So the condition for being received as such is to not be contaminated by the sin which separates us from Yahweh, because no sin is acceptable, even in the slightest degree or amount, in his sacred presence, which immediately and fully expels even the hint or suggestion of any sin. And I shall be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters to me, says Yahweh El Shaddai. El Shaddai translates as God Almighty. That's just another one of his titles. Having then these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of the flesh and spirit, perfecting sacredness in the reverence and fear of Elohim. So the purpose for which they were separated was an act of worship, which not only enabled them to worship accurately and fully, but also to honor the object of their worship by not contaminating any alien or unwanted or forbidden influences. And the next two verses are going to come from the book of James, first chapter, 27th verse. Clean and undefiled religion before the Elohim and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, we exist in the world and therefore are very much at the mercy of the laws of physics and the laws of nature, but we do not necessarily have to be contaminated by the worldly values and ethos which corrupts the pure and undefiled religion. And orphans and widows are to be of special concern, and they are lost in the world, and we are to reach those who are lost in the world and lost because of the world. And verse 4, chapter 4, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with Elohim? Whoever therefore intends to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of Elohim. So I had earlier referenced the fact that we can have friends in the world, but we are not to be friends with the world. It's okay to have one foot in the door, just not so deep as to be submerged and to lose our identity, because as we come into contact with mass media saturating our daily lives, we have to keep ourselves at deliberate distance from the contaminating influences of the world, which are omnipresent in our age of information with exponential technological increases. And the price of being friendly with the world is we forfeit the friendship of Elohim. So from the outside looking in, objectively and rationally, there's no argument that can be made in favor of favoring the world at the expense of heaven. And the final verse we're going to touch on today is Revelation 18:4. And I heard another voice from the heavens saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. This reminds us of an injunction in Exodus. This brings us to the Passover, Exodus 12:13, the language. And the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I shall pass over you, and let the plagues not come on you to destroy you, when I smite the land of Egypt. So the condition which Israel was to obey in order to be passed over from the angel of death was to mark themselves safe by the blood of the Lamb, whereas the people in the end times to whom John is preaching to, its historical echo has reverberated in every generation since, and they're coming out of is Babylon, which is analogously the worldly system. Now, Babylon, by this point in history, had ceased to become a major metropolis, so much so that the Roman Empire, Trajan, through whom the Roman Empire witnessed its greatest territorial expansion, he ventured as far into the Parthian Empire as Babylon in 117 AD and found essentially what is a ghost town. But the city and the symbolism survived as the model of worldliness, which is the satanic stronghold of the system, and we are called to come out of it. So if you are still in the world but wanting to come crossover, I invite you here and now to make the next step, make it complete, and keep yourself separated from that which is harmful and separate yourself unto that which is good. So there are both sides to the same coin, and we want to approach it in the whole and in balance. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.